All right, so Brian Ferneyhough, he was born in Coventry in 1943 to a non-musical family. His father, I do not actually recall what job he worked, but it was definitely not musical. And his mother had grown up in a household where education for women was considered unimportant and even unfortunate. So musically, there wasn't a lot going on. He had a pretty solitary childhood. He never really talked too much of anyone else. He developed a fascination for ruined structures later in life. He traces this back potentially to the city where he lived because there were bomb craters all over the place. Like on the way to school, he would walk around a bomb crater, and this was just normal to him. He was introduced to playing the cornet as a teenager when his band director the band director for his school, I should say, did a presentation on the different instruments that there were. He was fascinated by the cornet. He asked to try it out, and the band director thought he had talent, so he put him in the band. He was educated a lot of different places. He did not like to stay put. He He was educated at the Birmingham Conservatoire from 1961 to 1963. He then studied composition with Sir Lennox Berkeley from 66 to 67, Tom DeLue from 68 to 69, and then Klaus Huber from 69 to 71. His most major compositional influences include Sibelius, Jean Sibelius, and Thomas Tallis. Sibelius, I'm sure we all know. Tallis, maybe not so much. Tallis is an late Renaissance, early Baroque, I would say. He has received a lot of honors over his lifetime, including the Mendelssohn Scholarship in 1968, 3 prizes from the International Gudemus Music Week from 68 to 70, and then he was granted the Chevalier d'Ordre des Lettres from the French government in 1984. His most famous and notable works, although he's an incredibly prolific composer, so there are many, are his 6-string quartets, his Umbrations cycle, which was composed, as you can see, over quite a wide amount of time. Some sections are not able to be played separately, and others are separate movements that can be played outside of the context of the larger work. And then his lemma icon epigram is the one that probably you'll hear most often mentioned, although I haven't heard it and I don't know that many people who have. So before I get into this, I should explain New Complexity as an artistic movement a little bit. The major composers who are associated with the New Complexity movement are James Dillon, Brian Ferneyhough, of course, and then Michael Finnessy. I don't know much about Finnessy. James Dillon actually used to teach at the U of M. He retired, I want to say 5 or 6 years ago. He and Ferneyhough are actually very good friends. None of these composers like to be referred to as New Complexity composers. I'm not entirely sure why they don't like the term, but they really don't. One of the most distinctive characteristics of the New Complexity style is the notation. It does use what appears to be traditional notation at a glance, but it goes a little bit deeper because a lot of these rhythms are very complex and require split-second calculation on the part of the performer. For example, when we have a triplet, we might have, 3/8 notes or 3/4 notes, and then there's a bracket and a 3 over that. We know that that means put those 3 notes into the space of, say, 2/8 notes or 2/4 notes. Well, so what New Complexity does is one of their main things that they do with rhythm is they'll have, say, 5/16 notes with a bracket over it, and it says 5:4. That would be 5/16 notes in the space of 4. So it can be very, very difficult to read. New Complexity scores have the most information that they possibly can. Part of this is an attempt to give the performer too much information, more so than they could possibly ever play, to see how they handle it, what they do with their interpretation, and how far they push themselves to try and make it good. No new complexity composer is expecting absolute perfection from their musicians, but they do want them to push themselves as far as they can. And they love to see what happens when performer interpretation and the amount of effort they've put in reaches a peak in the performance. And then the other thing that's very characteristic of this movement is exaggeration. This is more prevalent in James Dillon and Brian Ferneyhough's work, I would say, although Brian Ferneyhough's later works mostly. Again, I don't know much about Fennessy. This exaggeration is very extreme dynamics, very fast rhythms, and very sharp articulations that then for a while get completely shut off. So we have things like you're doing very, very slow whole notes with harmonics, and all of a sudden you're plucking very sharply as fast as you can. That's a very big thing in new complexity. So the first piece that I want to look at is called Sieben Sterne. It was inspired by this woodcut that you can see here that was made by Albrecht Dürer in a book that he worked on from 1496 to 1498. It is in a post-apocalyptic image because it was Dürer put it into a book of painting of woodcuts of the apocalypse. As you can see, the two main things that you need to note about this piece about the art piece for the music piece are the 7 stars encircling God's hand and then the double-edged sword coming out of his mouth. So the title means 7 stars, Sieben Sterne. It was composed from about 1969 to about 1970. It is for organ and assistance, so it's a little unusual in that it does not have any microtonal quality to it because you can't do that with an organ. That's not super common for Ferneyhough, but it is a thing. It features 7 partially interlocking motives representing the 7 stars that are over God's hand, who is influenced very heavily by Thomas Tallis's Lamentations of Jeremiah, which I'm going to play a bit of in a second. And then the double-edged sword symbolizes for Ferneyhough dualities like life and death, day and night, truth and falsity, and other such dualities like that. So he tries to... His way of representing that in the piece is very heavily notated passages where there's like no leeway, if possible, for the performer, and then passages where it's barely notated at all with the instruction to try and make it sound as much like the notated passages as possible. So now I'm going to play you guys a section of Thomas Tallis's Lamentations first, and then I will play you a section of Sieben Sterne. As lovely as that is, you get the idea. Now here's Sieben Sterne. This is going to be jarring, perhaps, after this, but I would encourage you guys to listen for the similarities rather than the differences. Alright, as much as I would love to play that more, I want to try and make sure that I don't spend too much time presenting, so that I don't overstay what you guys had. Okay, so then the next piece that we're going to look at is his 5th string quartet. He made 6, as I said. They were composed, this particular string quartet was composed from 2003 to 2006 for the Arditi Quartet, whom he has worked with very closely for a long time. One thing that I forgot to put on the slide about this, but that is an idea that he likes to have, although I don't know if he's put it much into words, and that I've noticed, is this idea of kind of super tonality, or as I would refer to it, ultra romanticism, where it takes the traditional pulls and pushes that we get from semitones and the tension there and augments it by using microtones instead as leading tones and such. So there's a lot of that sort of push and pull in this quartet. This quartet also has very strong, like a lot of the same exaggeration elements that I've said is a bit of a hallmark of the New Complexity movement. We have very, very quiet dynamics in here. I think there's here and there, I don't know if it's in this quartet or if it's in another one, but there's certainly one of his quartets where he puts like 6 P's as the dynamic level and has a note that if the performer can hear themselves, they're too loud. So it's very, very exaggerated here. It goes from quiet and pretty gentle to very loud and fast, very rapidly. One thing to note is that this one, as does most of his pieces, at least with instruments that can do it, it's very microtonal. And so you won't be used to that. It'll be a little surprising. This is more rhythmically complex than Siebensterne for sure. And I'll pull up a video with the score so that you can see what that looks like. And then this one was very heavily influenced. I mean, all of his work was influenced by Sibelius, and particularly Sibelius' symphonies, but this one especially shows it. So again, I'm going to play you guys a section of a Sibelius symphony. I would ask that you try to listen for the similarities rather than the differences. I chose Sibelius' Symphony No. 1 because that's easy. I'm going to fast forward a little bit because this is quiet. Just so that you guys get a good representative sample. All right, I think that's probably good. Now, here's the string quartet. As you guys can note, looking, there's those brackets all over. This is their preferred way of showing notation, of showing rhythm, so that there's not a whole lot of room for, there's no room for misinterpretation as to what the rhythm should be. As you can see right here, there's the really complex time signatures. That's pretty common as well. I mean, given the name New Complexity. New Complexity scores are arguably some of the most complex visually. I'm not sure if they're truly the most complex musically, but they're certainly some of the most complex visually. All right, I think that's all the time that I have for that. I would encourage you guys to listen to the full thing if you get the chance, because it's really, really interesting. It's nice to listen to, if you want to think about it. So there's some fun facts about him, because I thought y'all would be interested in that. He has narcolepsy/catalepsy, well, both. So narcolepsy is a condition in which if you experience strong emotion, you could just randomly fall asleep. Catalepsy is nearly the same, and so it's often comorbid with narcolepsy. It often exists with narcolepsy. Patients who have one tend to have the other, and sometimes the distinction is not made, but it is a little different. Catalepsy occurs under the same circumstances, but the patient remains awake. They just cannot move or control their things. Because of his solitary childhood, he uses what he calls voice modes to prepare himself to talk. So if you ask him to talk, sometimes he'll say something like, oh, I don't, like if you wanted to interview him over the phone, he might say, oh, I don't have a spontaneous voice mode prepared for that. So that's fun. He's got the professor voice mode and some other fun things like that. And then he is friends with James Dillon. I think I mentioned that earlier, but they're really good friends. And their music is really interesting to compare and contrast too. So that's what I have for you. Here's all of my works cited. All right.